I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you for having me. I've always driven by the Google campus, but never got a chance to come in, so this is exciting. I wrote a book called Season that came out last October, so it's actually been exactly a year and a couple of days now. Writing a book is a terrifying experience. Photographing it is even crazier, and then cooking and styling everything is even nuttier. So people always ask me, how was it? And I say it was just crazy. There were days when I would do everything and lie on the floor and not move. But it was fun. It was the most rewarding experience of my life. And I feel anybody who writes a cookbook or gets into this business has a little bit of crazy, which I do. And I think that's what makes it a lot of fun. Season was a book that I wanted to write about from my own perspective, from my own point of view. I started out as a molecular biologist. I thought I would actually end up in health policy, so I went to public policy school at Georgetown, and then moved to California, gave everything up because I was fed up. And I worked as a pastry cook in Santa Clara and Sunnyvale for a while. Moved to Oakland, worked as a food photographer for a startup out there. Got a job at the Chronicle writing my column, and then that's when I signed on to write Season. So Season is my perspective of how I felt that I cook. For the longest time, when I moved to America, I felt that there was this notion of Indian food, and I think this happens with a lot of other cuisines too, where it is very one-dimensional. What you see in a restaurant is what represents India. And having grown up in India for 20 years of my life, it was not the India that I knew that was being represented. So I said, I'm going to write about food that I like, and I don't want anybody to define the way I cook or who I am. And so that was the concept behind Season, where I talk about Indian food, but it's also not an Indian cookbook, and it's also not an American cookbook per se. I feel how immigrants cook, at least I do, and I wanted to tell a story that this is, things are happening in the kitchen. Food is not static, it is dynamic, it's constantly evolving. And those are the concepts, and that's also reflected in the two dishes that I will cook today. My background is, my dad's Hindu, he's from the north. My mom's Catholic, she's from the west coast. And she comes from a Portuguese colony called Goa, former Portuguese colony called Goa. And so her food has shaped a lot of my thinking. And I feel because I grew up in that household with two different cultures, I don't have rules in my mind on how things should look or see. And so I've tried to do that with my food as well. So the two dishes we're going to cook today are the sweet potato bibingka, which is a dessert. Bibingka is also seen in the Philippines, but it's slightly different. The one that's made in Goa is a Goan dish, and the one that's made in Goa is made with either potatoes. I've taken a little bit of a tweak here and made it with sweet potatoes, because I like sweet potatoes. And I like anything sweet, which is why I worked as a pastry cook. And so sweet potatoes also look much nicer if you use the golden ones. And then the second dish that we're going to do is a paneer salad, which I was always perplexed by the idea when I went to a restaurant that was always saag paneer or matar paneer, and I didn't understand why it couldn't be used in different ways. Like, the Greeks have a lot of firm cheeses that hold their texture and their shape. Paneer also does that, and in many ways, paneer is like tofu, where it's a blank slate. It'll absorb a lot of flavors. So I wanted to showcase that. And I also like herbs a lot. I feel when everything fails, herbs will come to the rescue, right? Like if in winter, when everything's almost dead, you add a bit of mint to something and it feels like everything's alive again. So I feel this salad kind of plays with that idea during colder weather, where cauliflowers come into season and lentils and all these ingredients. So let's start with the savory side of this and then move on to the sweet, okay? So first what I'm going to do is start with the sauce for this recipe. I'm a lazy cook. I like things that go into the blender or things that I can roast, stick in the oven, walk away. Then there's a smaller component that can be added. So if you look at any of the work that I do, it's always focused on being lazy and quick in the kitchen. It is the best, really, honestly. I'm going to use cilantro. I usually use the stems with most herbs. I know some people don't like to use it, but the stems and the roots also of cilantro are quite full of flavor, and you can also make a really good stock if you use cilantro roots. A lot of Asian cultures will use just the cilantro root. So obviously wash it, get rid of the dirt and soil. But if you start using the different components, like even mint, cilantro, parsley, all of those components, including the stems, the roots, all have the flavor molecules in there that you can actually use to your own advantage. So in this case, you just dump everything. So I'm going to add the cilantro. Then I'm going to add coriander seeds. Black peppercorns. You don't need to grind black peppercorns before you add them in here because the blender will take care of this. Salt. I'm going to use a lime. I like limes because people always ask me this, whether it's a Mexican influence after I came here, but in India, where I grew up, we never had lemons. And lemons and limes, the words are used interchangeably. So every Indian dish that I've eaten always had limes in it. So when I read Indian cookbooks now in America, I get very confused when I see a lemon mentioned in there. It doesn't make sense to me because the profiles are so different.
So Nik, you said you love herbs. Is there a special favorite herb that you have?
I think this is also very like a cultural thing where I've mentioned mint 100 times already today, but mint and cilantro are probably the two that always come to mind immediately. Scallions, I treat scallions as herbs. I know some people drop them into the onion family and then leave them there, but scallions can also make a really good sauce. They're even milder than shallots. And so if you don't want a lot of oniony flavor, but you just want that mildness, I think that's a good spot. Green chilies, I think of anything green as an herb. Let's put it like that. I feel even green chilies, the bird's eye chili pepper, if you use the fresh ones, and then serranos are another thing that I find gives you, even if you don't want the heat, you take out the seeds and the midvein, and you just use the green part, you'll still get that herby flavor of the chili, so you're not missing out. So I'm going to add a bit of olive oil. And this is actually where I struggle with, being Indian and writing recipes now is, so in India we have this concept of the chutney. And then I know a lot of people describe chutney with just being water-based. And then there's pesto, when sometimes Indian authors want to kind of give that comparison. They call a lot of Indian chutneys are like pesto, but there's actually no fat in chutneys. So I struggle with a lot of these definitions, even as a seasoned writer now. Right, sometimes this can be also, a blender, a high-speed blender will save you so much time in the kitchen. Thank you. See, that's it. I love my blender. If there's one tool I tell people to invest in is a good high-speed blender, because sometimes even cake batters, especially if you're making an olive oil cake, do it in here, you'll get a very smooth crumb. You won't have large air bubbles in your cake slice, just because it emulsifies so well. Okay, so this is done. I'm going to leave it here. And then, so what I did, well, I didn't do this before, they've done it before, but it's kind of like the magic of television. So lentils. I like to soak my lentils, especially for lentils. As the thickness of the lentil increases, I find it faster to cook, and you get a better texture if you soak your lentils in water. I usually, again, like I said, sometimes I'm lazy, so I'll leave it overnight and come to it the next day, or maybe a couple of hours, depending on how thick it is. So in this case, both the lentils were soaked earlier, and so I'm going to boil the lentils till they're tender. One thing to remember when you cook lentils, the cooking time changes depending on the age of the lentil. So the longer a lentil is stored, the cooking time will change. So usually after the first half hour, I start watching it. So sometimes I don't use all the lentils that are in my house and I forget about them, which is a horrible thing to admit for a cook. But they stay for a while. And I've noticed over time that the cooking time does fluctuate depending on when it was last opened or when I bought it. So keep that in mind. It will change, not only depending on the type of the lentil. You can also pressure cook them. That'll be faster. Another thing to do with lentils and beans is if you add a bit of baking soda will dissolve the pectin in the seeds and make it much more softer. So you'll definitely get a mushier texture. That's something to keep in mind. And you can control how long you boil it to control the desired degree of the bite. Like in pasta, you have the al dente. You can do the same thing here.
Would that be a personal preference, or is there a right or wrong to how it
I don't think so. I feel sometimes we get so focused on, I'm going to say, the degree of doneness as some kind of marker of perfection. I think, especially with home cooks, I think the most important thing is to remember that you're not really selling a meal to anyone, and you're really not looking to impress anyone, except yourself, right? And if no one wants to eat it at home, you can eat it yourself. They can go hungry. So I think definitely focus on the flavors that you want. Don't beat yourself up if it gets overcooked and, oh, it became a little bit mushy. It's still fine, right? I mean, of course, if you're selling a meal, then yeah, pay attention to those things. All right, so I'm going to start with the paneer while this cooks. So like I mentioned, paneer is basically a cheese that's prepared by curdling milk. You boil milk, or you heat milk to a certain temperature, and then you add an acid to it. So the acid coagulates the proteins, kind of like ricotta is made, and then you drain everything out, and you discard the whey. And so you're left behind with the solid milk proteins. And it's pressed under high pressure, and in my book, there is a recipe for that, which will give you a much softer paneer. So for this recipe, because everything is cut in cubes, I recommend actually going out and buying it from a store. And now, especially here in California, most stores actually just sell it. I don't even go to the Indian store to buy paneer. I get it at my local grocery store, which is kind of cool to live in that age. And so see, it's pretty firm when you cut it. And then I like to cut it into small bites that are easy to bite because it also cooks much faster. And so you don't really have to focus too much on it. One thing with cooking is if you're cooking different ingredients at the same time or in the same pot, it is better to cut them all to the same size. More or less than you can average your cooking time, which makes it really easy. So in this case, I put the cauliflower and the paneer together in the oven to roast them. But because they're cut to the same size, it makes it easy to gauge how tender they are.
So I have a question, and if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and I can repeat it for you. What's your guilty pleasure food?
Ice cream. Without a doubt, ice cream. Is there a type? I like lemon ice cream. I like passion fruit and lemon. Anything that's tart mixed with sugar tastes really good. So lemon and then passion fruit are probably my top two favorite ice creams.
I like you even more now because I love ice cream. You had mentioned that a high-speed blender is something that somebody should always have in their kitchen. What else would you suggest?
Definitely the high-speed blender. I also tell people to have a microplane zester or a regular grater. That makes a huge difference, especially when you're trying to work with things like cheese. You want to grate your cheese to different degrees of different thicknesses. And then, graters are also useful when you're doing lemon zest or lime zest or citrus. It's the most basic thing you would ever do in the kitchen, but it immediately transforms the profile of a dish because it makes it so aromatic in that quick second. And then I don't think people should have 1,000 knives in the kitchen. I think just having one or two, like a sharp serrated knife, is probably really useful. And then one good knife that can pretty much cut everything. Because if you look all over the world, most people that, for example, who cook in street food stalls, right? They don't have like 1,000 knives, and they're going at it so fast, which is pretty impressive. So I don't think really need all that. And when I worked as a pastry cook, the tool that I used the most was my serrated knife. All right, so they've already chopped some up for me, which is cool. Okay, so cauliflower, you can, especially right now, I'm guessing all the farmers markets have different colored cauliflowers, so this is a great opportunity to take advantage of that. You can do like a 50-50 ratio, maybe of purple, yellow, white, whatever tickles your fancy. And Romanesco, the broccoli, would also work really great in this salad.
So when you start working on a recipe, do you already have something in your mind that you want to create, or do you just start going into the kitchen, looking into your refrigerator, and get inspired?
Okay, so what influences my cooking, basically, right? Okay, so if it's seasonal, like if I'm writing for the column at the newspaper, if there's a seasonal topic like Thanksgiving, then I need to think about that in a little more depth. Sometimes I have a very large cookbook collection, and so sometimes I'll go through a lot of those books just to kind of see how things were done at some point, maybe bring a technique back. Also something that I've never done, so it's a learning experience for me. That's how I usually treat any recipe, as a learning experience for me to grow. Sometimes I want to focus on maybe the science of a technique. So then I'll go down that rabbit hole and focus on that. But usually I try to come with the perspective that it is something that's perhaps really different, so it's contributing something new. Because I don't think there's any point in my discussing something like dal, the Indian lentil dish. There's nothing that I'm really going to change in the conversation unless I'm coming at it from a different angle. The same thing with a chocolate brownie. There's something new that I have to do with it, because otherwise there already are, but like maybe 1,000, 10,000 brownie recipes, and I'm not really going to make an impact. Okay, so I like these really tiny because they cook fast and it's easier to eat with a fork. But yeah, I mean, if you have a big fork, and you by all means.
So having your science background, do you weigh all of your food, or do you measure?
Yeah, that's always a struggle. So I like to weigh everything in grams. I still do it, because that's the way. I mean, we even do science, right? We use Celsius and we use grams for everything. I also do not understand how people measure a cup of peas. I don't understand that. Like I get all-purpose flour because there's just not enough space between all those grains of flour, so you more or less kind of get an average estimate. But with something like peas, and I know it's beloved, it's something that people fight about, cups. People really love their cups. I struggle with it because I don't understand the logic, so I give both the measurements with the caveat that I really don't understand how it exists. For liquids, yes. I mean, by liquids, all means, go ahead. All right, so once this is done, and again, with the magic of being in the Google kitchen, I don't really have to roast it, but you toss it with oil and season it with salt and pepper, and then you roast it, and it will look like this. So it will shrink because there's both of these well, paneer doesn't contain that much water, but cauliflower is just a lot of water. So keep that in mind when you cook. And so if you need to adjust the amounts, these recipes are pretty flexible, adjusted to the number of guests that you have. And then the lentils are also done magically. Okay, so you don't have to stick to my types of lentils here. You could do either or, whatever you have. I find it a little more colorful and texturally interesting when you have two different sizes in here, which is why I put the two together.
I have another question. I have lots of questions, I guess.
Okay.
What do you cook when you're alone and you don't have to impress anybody and you're just tired?
When I'm just tired. Let's see. It has to be something really lazy. I mentioned lazy a lot. But let's see. I like plain yogurt, and so I can actually get by just eating plain yogurt and rice. Um, if I don't want the rice, gosh, that's actually a difficult question. But usually it's whatever's in my pantry because I keep a lot of condiments. I may not have a lot of actual cooked food in my pantry, in my refrigerator, but I definitely have a lot of random condiments. So I feel condiments are the easiest way to kind of just throw something together, even if it doesn't make sense at that point. Like I'll throw in lemon preserves with pastrami and put it on white bread, which was my meal while I was working on a project recently. I didn't want to eat anything that I was cooking because I was smelling, tasting, and tasting the same thing daily, at least 4 or 5 times. And didn't want anything to do with that, so I called my friends up, they would collect that, and then I literally ate pastrami sandwiches with lemon preserves and mayonnaise for a couple of weeks. Now I cannot do it, but yeah. All right, so I'm just going to toss everything together. One thing you can do if you've prepped everything beforehand, even with the lentils, if you put a little bit of olive oil on top, it will prevent them from drying out. This is why I like gas stoves. I recently switched to a gas stove after years of having an electric stove. And then we lost electricity, and I was very happy last. All right, so this is basically thrown in the scallions. If you want this hotter, you can definitely add fresh green chilies to it. And then with the sauce, I add a little bit. Some of my friends like it very saucy, so I just keep it on the side. And then, yeah, just like toss it and mix it together, and that's it. It's pretty straightforward. And this salad is good for up to 3 days if you refrigerate it. Definitely, because it's cooked, it'll dehydrate. So I would recommend either putting cling film on top or keeping it in an airtight container. Yep, and that's it. It's pretty straightforward. In the new cookbook or the previous, this one? This one I did all except for the childhood photos of me because at that point I hated cameras. My dad's he's retired now. My dad used to be in advertising and worked as an advertising photographer. So he did a lot of India's, what do you say, Bollywood. So my dad used to do a lot of work for that. And so he took a lot of photos of me as a kid, which I kind of stole and threw into this. And as a kid, I actually hated the camera because every time you would walk into the house, camera equipment is a lot. I mean, if you look, it takes up a lot of space. And you would walk around the house, and you were walking into a minefield because he would yell at you for bumping into stuff because it was so expensive, and then it was just there. So I hated it, and funny enough now, like the apple hasn't fallen far away from the tree.
Is it all over the house?
Now, yeah, yes. My stuff is all over the house, but I don't have kids, so it's fine.
So you're working on a new book, right?
I am, yeah. I'm working on a new book, which is very different from this book. The first book was kind of my introduction, and then the second book is the first book was more about who I am. The second book is more about how I think, and since I trained as a biochemist and I also studied public policy, I wanted to write a cookbook that kind of brought all those things together and talk about human behavior and taste. And so the second book, there's no title yet, but That's the second book. It's a very biochemistry-driven, human behavior-driven cookbook. So it's very experimental, where I'm doing things that are experimental, but also explaining the science behind why we behave a certain way. And then I also wanted to explore some of the science behind a lot of Asian cooking, because I felt predominantly the books that I've read about science have always focused on a lot of Eurocentric dishes, like mayonnaise is used as an example for emulsions. But why can't we talk about Lebanese toum as an example, right? And a lot of the questions that I struggled with and could never find answers to, I said, okay, let me see, why are these things happening in the kitchen? What's going on? And has there been any research done on it? And there is. And so, having that, I think that background in biochemistry kind of helped me tie those knots together, and we'll see how we'll see.
When is it expected out?
It'll be, I don't know the month yet, but it'll definitely be fall next year. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to start with the sweet potato bibinka. I like sweet potatoes, like I said, because they're sweet, but there is something else behind sweet potatoes. If you roast a sweet potato, you get, this is where the science will come in, there are at least 17 different new flavor molecules that are created in a sweet potato, and versus boiling or blanching. And I think that's what makes it really spectacular, because you can sometimes, if you pay close attention to the smell, you can also smell vanilla, which is so bizarre. Like, you don't have vanilla actually in a sweet potato, but it forms during roasting. So I roast sweet potatoes whenever I can, and I think it just makes it taste much more better. So you start out with sweet potatoes, you roast them till they get really tender. And then we're basically going to mash them up. You can put them in a blender. Again, this is where I think like a blender is pretty amazing. And you can actually do this whole recipe in the blender if it's big enough. Because even though there's flour, the gluten formation really doesn't affect it. It's such a liquid batter, you won't have a problem.
So considering that we're coming into fall, is this something that you've served at, say, Thanksgiving, or can we use it for Thanksgiving?
Yeah, so when the book came out last year, I was a little nervous about this recipe just because of the name. No one knows what it is. I mean, people in India also haven't really heard about it unless they know people from Goa. But the New York Times put this recipe up last year, and it was one of their top, I think, top 10 or 20 recipes for fall, which was crazy. So I think what makes it really accessible is the fact that you have all these ingredients. The jaggery, which is an Indian brown sugar, which I'll go through in a little bit, just use dark brown sugar, or muscovado, which has that similar molasses-like flavor. And then you don't need to make a pie crust. So this could be substituted as your sweet potato pie during Thanksgiving. And I think that makes it just really easy.
So what is jaggery made out of? It's a sugar, but is it from something else?
So jaggery is basically when sugarcane juice or the palm sugar is collected from the coconut tree, and it's concentrated in large copper pans and heated. What happens then is you get this, it's sometimes sold as a block, and the color of the block can go from golden, like this is, to really dark brown. And usually the ones that are made with coconut or palm juice is much darker and has a stronger flavor. You can also use ground jaggery, which is sold in stores, which actually makes it really easy for cakes and baking. And I actually go with that because it's one less step, but it's really easy to work with. You can just take a knife and saw at it. And then you weigh it out. It also dissolves really fast. The one thing with jaggery is that it is hygroscopic, so it absorbs moisture from the air. So what I always do is I keep it with a little bit of rice flour or rice grains. So the rice absorbs the moisture and keeps it dry. And then if you have those silica gel packets that come with food and clothes, you can just put those in there. It absorbs moisture. That's what I do with everything at home. Right.
What are some of your favorite and versatile spices to use in the kitchen?
Spices? So it depends on the application. One of my favorite spices is sumac because it gives acidity without adding liquid. So if I'm doing something where I don't want to increase the volume of the dish, I use sumac as my acidic ingredient. There's also another acidic ingredient which also works really well with spicy flavors called amchur, which is basically unripe mango that's sun-dried and ground to a powder. Um, let's see, cardamom. I do like green cardamom, but I feel it's become way too popular now that I don't like to use it. It's a struggle sometimes because a lot of Indian desserts also use cardamom, and I always worry that, can he do anything else besides using cardamom? Um, Cinnamon, the different types of cinnamon, like Ceylon cinnamon and true cinnamon, cassia and true cinnamon. So I think those are really fun, different takes on the same thing. Um, I, I think there's just so many spices right now, it's hard to pick, especially in this day and age where I think that's the next place where food is going, is to look at spices and see how one particular dish can be changed again and again. So the question is about how did I develop my style of photography and point of view. Um, One of the things, so I started out as a food blogger not knowing what I was getting into. At that point, I had no ambitions of writing a cookbook or writing for a newspaper. None of that had crossed my mind. But I wanted to write about food, and then I saw everyone taking photographs because back then, photography was the medium that people were tasting. They may not cook your dishes on your blog, but they'll definitely come back if they like your photos. And so I had to learn how to photograph. I didn't learn from my dad because I hated cameras and we weren't allowed to touch them. So when I came here and several years later, I actually got into the blog world, and I got my first camera, which was a point and shoot from Nikon, and I taught myself how to photograph. But it took me, I want to say 5 years, maybe of just trying to understand what I wanted to convey, because one of the things is, if you photograph like everyone else, no one's going to look at your work, right? So you're part of you're following everyone else, and then I felt that if I had a point of view in terms of the food that I wanted to cook and write about, I should have a visual point of view too, to tell a story, especially in the format that I was trying to communicate with people. One of the things with me is that I like minimalism. I actually get very anxious when I used to work in a lab, all the computer wires back then used to be stacked behind, and it would drive me nuts. So I like minimalism, and that way everything's hidden and only one thing is on the table, so to speak. And so I try to bring that in my photography. When I think of food, one of the reasons why I even quit my job in science was I like the process also. And because I like the process in cooking, I want to talk about the process too, what makes it so special. And I think sometimes in photos, in magazines, you always see the final hero shot. We call it the hero shot. Why can't we do anything else? Because there's just so much happening in a kitchen that it's so lively. It might be the simplest thing that we don't pay attention to, like adding salt. And so I wanted to convey all those steps. Sometimes recipes were better conveyed through photos, especially if it was an instructional thing like making a pie crust. I personally find it easier to see photos and watch videos than to read text, because I remember learning how to do a lattice from a cookbook. And it was a mess because it kept saying to flip things over and over, and there were no photos. And it was just a weird geometric shape that was on the pie. It didn't work for me. So that's one of the other reasons. And then the second thing was, when I think of food being kind of like a ballerina on a stage, even the process, where she's dancing on stage and the entire focus is on her. Everything else falls to the background and it's noise. So that's one of the reasons why I like to shoot dark. I also, with food, sometimes I feel there is this notion that everything needs to be brightly lit and you have to see every component of what's on the plate. I don't think you have to. I think that's what makes the human eye more curious, is that you want to see what's missing or you can't see. And so I think that provides a narrative for the viewer, which I try to convey through my photos. Mm-hmm. All right, so I melted the butter. Add butter, and then eggs. I'm adding the liquids now with this because it'll be easier to blend really fast.
So you write a lot about ghee.
Yeah, he was my muse. I mean, I wouldn't say was, but it's still my muse. I like to pick certain ingredients every time I write a book. Well, I've only written one, but I'm doing that with the second book too. I pick a muse, and so with the first book, it was definitely tamarind, jaggery, and ghee, because I feel these are ingredients that aren't really explored that much out of the context that we're familiar with, and even for me. So I set a few challenges for myself. I was going to use ghee as the fat for a cake, to create a sponge cake, and see if I could do it. Worked out really well. I mean, it creates a really beautiful sponge, and if you like milk cakes with that strong, nutty, caramely flavor, that's a good cake to make, and then you can use it like you would a Victoria sponge. Put jelly, jam. I like creme fraiche, so creme fraiche, I guess that was also my muse in the last book. Tamarind is another ingredient which I think is so delicious because it's, depending on the stage you pick it, it's sour-ish sweet. In Mexican cooking, you'll usually find the riper pods used, and so it's sweeter. In Indian cooking, usually they pick them off much earlier from the tree, and they are much more acidic. So a little bit of tamarind goes a long way. So you can use it for sweet and savory dishes, like I did in the book. There's a drink with ginger, the tamarind refresher, that works really well. There's just so much you can do. Add it to curries, or even like dals and stuff. You add a little bit, it goes a long way. You don't need to add lemon juice. And then jaggery, of course, I'm using it now. I feel jaggery has a much more complex flavor. Like, I like sweet, but I want the sweet to have some value. I just don't want to taste sweet. I think sweet tastes better when it comes with its own nuances. So like maple syrup. Maple syrup, depending on the source, you can have so many different flavors. Honey is another sweetener like that, depending on the flower that was used. You could have an orange blossom, lavender. So I think those are the things that really excite me. What is one recipe everyone has? It's like ask me to pick my child, right? Favorite child. Yeah. I used to ask my mother to do that, and she never did that. Yeah, it was always a bone of contention with my sister and me. Let's see. If you want something sweet, I would recommend starting out with the bibinka because it is such a good way to explore different flavors, but it's easy, it's quick. In terms of savory, I would recommend starting out with the naan, and I usually do not like to promote naan that much because it doesn't need me to market it out, but I feel using that naan dough in the book as the pizza base actually creates a really beautiful crust. And if you have a pizza stone that can go up to 500 or more Fahrenheit, you will get that blistered edge on that particular dough really well. I've never had that much luck with just flour and water in home ovens. But I think just because of the combination of yogurt and eggs in it really helps get that texture.
I made your blistered dates and raisins, which was just fascinating because it was so simple and delicious, especially on yogurt.
It's the easiest thing to do. In fact, my dad taught me how to do that, and he used to call us, I don't know if he still does it, but he used to call it as kebabs, fruit kebabs. And skewer them on coconut skewers, coconut leaf skewers, and then roast them on the fire. And then I would eat them directly, but I think they're just such an easy thing to do in terms of a flavor booster that you have a little bit of heat from the pepper, a little bit of salt, and the sweetness of the fruit. And yogurt, you can even serve it. I've also done this where I'll serve it with a pulao on the side of rice, where you have that accompaniment to meat of vegetables, and it works really well. So I think it goes beyond one of those little things where you do a little tweak and it goes a long way. So I like adding turmeric as a coloring agent rather than a flavoring agent. I'm not a big fan of raw turmeric flavor. I find it too pungent. So here, because sometimes the sweet potato color doesn't translate well, I add a little bit of turmeric just to boost that color. And then this is a bit of nutmeg, salt, and then sugar. I'm going to add a little bit later. Okay. I really tried to do a good job. Someone asked me if I was going to have a recipe for puff pastry, and I said, no, not doing it in this book. I think the most complicated thing in the book depends on your skill level. So the book, I basically wrote the book to kind of address that. So if someone wants to start out at something really at a basic level, you start with something like the dates. And then if you want to go a little further, I would say the lentil and cauliflower dish is a little more involved. And then if you really want to go complex, I think the upside down orange cake. From what I've seen so far when interacting with people who cook my recipes at in newspapers and magazines, is the more the number of ingredients, that defines complexity. It's not the number of steps. So, and that's very interesting for me, because for me it's the other way around. Like, oh, if I have to like weave a lattice, it seems more complex. But people literally go by the number of ingredients. All right, and this part is really straightforward. It's basically mixing all the liquids with the sugar and then the flour, which also is weighed out. Right? And then you mix it together. You can also do this in a blender, or if this was big wide enough, I would actually do it here. Whisk. And if you're gluten sensitive, you can use the 1:1 gluten substitute flour that's available in stores. It'll work here. And then a pie pan. Or you can use a cake pan, whatever you want.
So the pie pan seems to be lined?
It's lined and greased. I like to line it because it makes it easier to lift out. And then the butter obviously makes it release from the side really well. The one thing with this, it's like a flan. So with most like baked custards and puddings, when you bake it in the oven, you want that little jiggle in the center, but on the sides it should be firm. And then let it sit overnight in the fridge to firm up, because the eggs do need time to bond and get that structure proper. If you cut it the day off, it will fall apart. But if you let it sit in the fridge overnight, I would say maximum maybe 6 to 8 hours, and you should be fine. And then you bake it, and it will be ready. Because I don't.
We have some ready too. Do you need to put it in a bain-marie at all, or?
Not this, no. If I were making a flan, yes. Just because the flan, the egg to milk ratio is very different from this. There's flour here. Flan doesn't really have flour also. So I usually definitely prefer getting feedback from people I don't know. So what I do is, because I feel that friends and family will always be kind of skewed to go in a positive direction. So what I usually do is, especially with this book, I had people from different parts of the world recipe test for me. And then I had sample forms for them where they filled out, and actually Google Forms, which has been really useful even for the second book, because I can get stats from them. I can plot the data. So like I know what kind of equipment they have, what kind of ingredients were available in different parts of the world. It's weird because there were things that I was nervous about, like curry leaves. There were people in Switzerland who were very excited about the curry leaves and could access them, but there were people in Oakland who couldn't. And that threw me off, because Oakland does have a large, international population, but, people in Switzerland could test it. And then it also gives me a sense of what kind of equipment people have in their kitchen. So for this second book, I was able to determine a percentage of the number of people that responded to the survey, whether they have ice cream makers or not. And so that helps define my choices then when I create recipes to make it accessible. Or I like to go for my pastries. Get me into trouble on this. I do like Craftsman and Wolves a lot. And then dandelion chocolate. I do love dandelion chocolate a lot. Yeah.
Okay, so if we could please give Nik a big round of applause.
Thank you.